questions, and obviously I haven't been available for like a week or so. So, first of all, I know what you guys are going to ask, and I did think it was a flagrant foul. And our reffing just needs to be better. And, it's tough. Obviously, the refs are in a really difficult spot. It's one of the hardest jobs in the world, in my opinion, is to make calls. All you do is get yelled at the whole time by everybody. You're never winning. So I think for us, as the league's just got to do better, protecting our players, feeling a lot better, excited to get back into practice today, and then feeling really, really positive about getting back into one of the games at the back-to-back. Obviously, difficult coming back in a back-to-back, so we'll have to be cautious of that. But I feel a lot better, and like I said, excited to get back into practice. And this week has been very helpful for my overall health. So other than that, if you guys have any questions, I know I kind of just ranted for a while, but feeling a lot.
Okay. She said difficulty coming back in a back-to-back. She
stood at the podium for the first time in over a week, and the first thing she did was defend the referees who have been failing to protect her from the targeting that put her at that podium in the first place. The Kennedy Carter hip check on June 1st was not close, was not ambiguous, was nowhere near the ball, and the officials on the floor missed it entirely in real time while it happened in front of thousands of people and every broadcast camera in the building. It took the league reviewing the tape after the game and upgrading the call retroactively, a process that confirmed what everyone watching could see immediately, and that did nothing for the player who absorbed the contact before any review was possible. Her first public statement after a week of silence was that officiating is one of the hardest jobs in the world, and that the refs deserved better support, better pay, and better technology delivered by the person whose body their decisions are supposed to be protecting on a nightly basis. She did exactly what everyone who has followed her since Iowa knew she would do. She took the institutional position. She extended benefit of the doubt. She asked for systemic improvement without assigning individual blame. And she redirected the conversation toward the league's health rather than her own. That response is either the most consistent expression of genuine character available in professional sports right now, or it is the most self-defeating pattern that any star player has produced in a league that has been watching her absorb targeting for 2 full seasons without adequate intervention.
Better, and we have to invest in those areas. The technology can get better. We can treat the referees a little bit better, pay them like they're full-time employees. I think things like that. And I think a lot has obviously come after that. And as I've stood up here and said before, like the harassment, the hate, none of that is okay. That goes for the opposing team we play. That goes for my teammates. That goes for my coaches. There should never be a question of character. Like I've always stood up here and said that, and that's truly what I believe. That's how I was raised. So, none of that is okay. And I don't want anybody to ever experience that. I think it can be really frustrating to me at times. And I think it's difficult. I think a lot of people sometimes think I'm a robot. I'm not a robot. I have emotions, I have feelings, and it can be really difficult to go through a lot of that. And, I'm 24 years old trying to navigate a lot. And I think at times I've been in this world for 4 years now, and you would never change any of it. But there are times that it is hard, and there are times that, it probably affects me a little bit more than I do put on. And, I would never change any of that for the world. But I think it's important that people do remember that part of it too. So, at the same time, it's really interesting to me because, even I turned the TV on Sunday, and that game was on Wednesday, and that's all people are still talking about. And I feel like that's just a real disservice to our league. And I get it. You talk about it. You talk about whether it's flagrant. You talk about whatever it is.
The thing she said that actually mattered underneath all of the diplomacy was the admission that she is not a robot, that she has emotions and feelings, and that what she is navigating probably affects her more than she shows. She is 24 years old. She has been in professional basketball for less than 2 years. And the league has placed on her shoulders the financial weight of its most significant commercial moment, while simultaneously failing to build the institutional infrastructure required to protect the player generating that moment. The veteran community spent years telling casual observers that the WNBA product was elite and that the only barrier to growth was media coverage and cultural sexism. And then one specific player arrived and the ratings came. The coverage came, the sold-out arenas came, and the problem revealed itself to be more complicated than the simple narrative had allowed. Veteran players who dedicated a decade to this league watched a first-year player receive more commercial attention in 3 months than they had accumulated across entire careers. More sponsorships, more screen time, more television cameras following her around buildings they had been playing in without that level of coverage for years. That resentment is real, it is human, and it is completely understandable as an emotional response to a sudden and dramatic reordering of who the commercial infrastructure of an entire league is organized around. What is not understandable is allowing that resentment to be expressed through physical targeting on a professional basketball court with no adequate officiating response and no institutional consequence that matches the severity of what has been permitted to continue.
To be taken other places that is really just that's just really not acceptable, I think it's hard to see, and it's a disservice to my team, but it's also a disservice to the other teams in this league and other players in this league. There's so much amazing talent, and there's so many amazing players that are playing at an incredibly high rate. And I remember, I think it was Sunday or Saturday, whatever day that was. I remember watching them discuss it on TV, and I didn't know they were going to discuss it. I was just watching the other games because I try to watch as much as I can. And I honestly felt bad for the players that were playing in the games those days. And also, I felt bad for my teammates. They played on Friday, and they dominated, and they played really well, and nobody wanted to talk about that. They were just worried about everything else. So, and there had been, I think 10 plus other games that had already happened to that point. So, I think it's all of our jobs to help refocus the narratives a lot of the times, and we can do better at that. And I think it'll help our game grow.
Carter's social media post after the flagrant foul upgrade was one of the most revealing moments of this entire controversy, precisely because it arrived while the targeting was still actively being discussed and while the player who had been hit was still on the injury report. She asked publicly what Clark even brings besides three-point shooting, a question that the television ratings, the sold-out arenas, the jersey sales, and the 2.3 million viewers on ABC for a single regular season game in June had already answered without requiring any additional commentary. The timing of that post, the content of it, and the platform used to deliver it tell you everything about the institutional culture the league has built around the player, who is most responsible for the commercial growth that makes posts like that possible in the first place. Clark's response to that post was to defend Carter from online harassment and to ask people to stop directing hate at opposing players, delivered by the same player who had just been upgraded to a flagrant foul for the hit that Carter's post appeared to mock. That sequence, hit, social media dismissal, public defense from the person who was hit, is the loop that has been running throughout this season. And the fact that it continues to run without the loop being interrupted by institutional intervention is the most damning single fact available about how the WNBA is managing its relationship with its most valuable asset. The question worth asking is not whether she is handling it with grace, she clearly is, but whether grace is the appropriate response to a pattern that grace alone cannot interrupt or resolve.
By the way, she gave exactly the statement I expected. All right, a very canned statement. She shot down online harassment and hate. I knew she would make this statement. There was no way with her having to play in this league with these players, there was no way she was not going to do the I'm condemning hate and online harassment, blah, blah, blah. She was always going to do that. All right? If anybody expected that she wouldn't, you were wrong.
The Kennedy Carter incident is not an isolated event, and treating it as one misses the structural reality that Clark herself has been trying to describe from the podium every time she is given a microphone. The league has been discussing better player protection rules for 3 years according to her own public statements, 3 years that predate her arrival in the WNBA entirely, which means the officiating infrastructure problem is not a consequence of her presence, but a pre-existing condition that her presence has made impossible to continue ignoring. She walked into a league that already knew its player protection framework was inadequate, that had already identified the problem in internal discussions, and that had not resolved it before the player most likely to require its full functioning at the highest level arrived and started getting targeted on national television. The post-game foul upgrade process is the most complete illustration of what institutional inadequacy looks like in practice. A dangerous play occurs, the officials miss it, the league reviews the tape, and the upgrade arrives days later in a press release that changes nothing about what the player absorbed during the game or what happens on the next possession in the next game. Real protection, as she herself described, would mean the foul is called in the moment in front of the crowd, so that every player on the floor understands immediately that the action produces a consequence, rather than discovering it 2 days later through a league communication. Real protection would mean suspensions with deterrent value, rather than upgrades that arrive after the media cycle has already processed the incident and moved on to whatever controversy the following game produced.
Look, you gotta say one thing. She's always thinking about everybody else but her. However, she did make it clear that was a foul. The league needs to do better. And of course, she tried to spin it towards the rest of the league too. But we knew this would happen. We knew that this would be the kind of statement she would give. She's always trying to, and here's the problem. She's such an unselfish person and player in what is a unbelievably selfish league, petty league and jealous league. And her personality could not be more opposite to her fellow players in the league.
The financial reality of her position in this league makes the institutional failure to protect her specifically more consequential than any previous player protection failure in the WNBA history. The 2.3 million viewers for Indiana versus New York was the most-watched WNBA regular season game in over 2 decades, a number that was not produced by a marketing campaign, not produced by a broadcast scheduling decision, and not produced by any institutional initiative. It was produced by one player's presence in a league that had been struggling with commercial relevance for years before she arrived. And every television executive, every sponsor, and every arena manager in the country understands what that number means for the contract conversations happening right now. The jersey sales, the sold-out road games. The casual fans who have never previously watched a WNBA game but are now checking in regularly. All of it is connected to one player's commercial draw, and that player is currently being physically targeted in patterns that the officiating infrastructure is not adequately addressing. The business case for protecting her is so straightforward that the failure to do so at the institutional level becomes increasingly difficult to explain as anything other than an organizational culture that has not yet fully aligned its priorities with the commercial moment it is actively inhabiting. You cannot simultaneously negotiate a multi-billion-dollar broadcast deal on the basis of viewer numbers that one player is primarily responsible for generating and allow that player to absorb unaddressed physical targeting on the floor, without the disconnect eventually reaching the television executives and sponsors who are making financial decisions based on her continued healthy presence. The injury situation layering on top of the targeting controversy creates a compounding picture that the press conference addressed directly, and that the back-to-back scheduling following her return makes significantly more complicated. She confirmed she was sitting out the July 2nd game against Las Vegas before returning for back-to-back against Phoenix that she described as physically demanding in a way that required caution. And the caution required is itself a product of a season where her body has been absorbing contact and compensatory strain without adequate structural intervention. Tim Grover's public assessment connecting her cycling soft tissue injuries to the muscle gain from the off-season and the absence of biomechanical correction is the most credentialed outside voice available on the subject. And the fact that it arrives from outside rather than from inside the organizational medical structure is the revealing detail. A player who has sought outside medical opinions on recurring injuries is communicating something specific about her confidence in the system that was supposed to be her primary source of care. And the league has not publicly responded to Grover's assessment in any way that suggests the organizational framework is being updated to address what he described. Her body is being asked to perform at elite level through a pattern of recurring soft tissue issues in a league schedule that does not build in the recovery windows that the pattern requires. Inside an organizational structure whose medical response has been reactive rather than preventive. The back-to-back return that she is being cautious about is one data point in a season full of data points that all point in the same direction. The infrastructure around the most commercially important player in the league's history has not been scaled to match the demands being placed on that player. The thing she said about the Kennedy Carter situation generating continuous television coverage while her teammates played well on Friday and received almost no attention captures the broader media dynamic that is simultaneously her biggest commercial asset and her most exhausting daily reality. She turned on the television on Sunday, and the game from Wednesday was still the primary topic of discussion on every sports show she encountered, which means a physical altercation involving her name was consuming the oxygen that her teammates' strong performance deserved and could not access. Her instinct at that moment, to feel bad for the players competing on those Sunday broadcasts who had to fight for attention against a controversy from 4 days earlier, is the specific kind of selflessness that commentary keeps praising without asking whether it is serving her interests or simply allowing the cycle to continue. The media will not stop covering the targeting controversy because the targeting controversy generates more engagement than a regular season win. And the league will not fully address the targeting controversy until the media pressure reaches the point where the commercial cost of inaction exceeds the institutional inertia, maintaining the current approach. She is stuck in the middle of that calculus. Her own experience is the fuel driving both the controversy coverage and the commercial growth. And every time she takes the high road and redirects toward the league's health rather than her own, the cycle resets without the underlying pressure changing. The narrative she wants competitive basketball driving the story rather than physical targeting and officiating failures cannot be produced by her own behavior alone. Because the conditions that would produce it require institutional action that her grace and her diplomacy cannot substitute for. The broader question her press conference raised without fully answering is whether the league is capable of building an environment in which she is actually protected rather than simply praised for enduring the absence of protection with sufficient composure. The pattern that has emerged across 2 seasons is consistent enough to describe accurately. She gets targeted, the targeting generates media controversy. She takes the high road in the press conference. The league issues a statement, nothing structural changes, and the next targeting incident arrives within a few games. Breaking that pattern requires something different than another press conference, another post-game review. Another flag upgrading a foul days after the crowd that witnessed it has gone home. It requires the officiating crew to call the foul in the moment, in front of everyone, so that the deterrent operates at the speed of the game rather than the speed of the league's review process. The players targeting her are making real-time calculations about what the officiating environment will permit. In every game where the calculation produces a result that suggests the environment permits more than the rulebook describes, the next calculation starts from a more permissive baseline. Changing that baseline requires changing what happens in the moment, not in the press release, not in the fan engagement campaign, and not in the statement about the league's commitment to player safety that arrives after the cycle has already produced its next controversy and moved on. She said clearly that the league just has to do better protecting its players, and she said it without anger, without accusation, and without naming anyone. And then she described feeling bad for everybody else while the building that should be protecting her continues operating on the model that produces the pattern she keeps having to stand at a podium and describe. The resentment from veteran players that her commercial presence has activated is the most politically sensitive component of this entire situation and the one that receives the least honest public examination. She did not arrive in a league of equals and claim unfair advantage. She arrived in a league where the commercial gap between players was already vast, already visible, already producing the kind of frustration that years of inadequate media coverage and inadequate organizational investment had been quietly building. Her presence did not create the resentment. It revealed that the resentment was already fully formed and looking for target. And she became that target because her commercial impact made the existing inequity impossible to maintain in the soft focus framing the league had been applying to it for years. Veterans who spent a decade grinding for minimal media attention watched her arrive and receive in months what they had been told for years was impossible for the women's game to generate. And the message that sequence delivers about what the earlier years of struggle were actually for is one that nobody at the organizational level has addressed directly or honestly. She is not responsible for that message, and she is not capable of resolving the resentment it produced through her own behavior, because the resentment is institutional rather than personal. It is a response to what the league was and what it became and the specific order in which those things happened. The league owes its veterans an honest reckoning with that history, an acknowledgement of what their years of play built and what they were not given in return for building it, and a structural response that does not ask them to celebrate her commercial success as a zero-sum loss for their own legacy. The officiating double standard has been documented across enough games and enough incidents that the accumulated record is no longer something the league can frame as a collection of individual close calls that reasonable officials evaluated differently in real time. She receives technical fouls for sideline clapping, while other players conduct extended emotional demonstrations in front of the same officials without consequence. And the pattern across those incidents, visible to anyone watching multiple games in sequence, is not consistent with a single standard applied to all players equally. The two-tier system being applied, one threshold for her reactions and a different threshold for veteran players expressing the same level of frustration, is the most visible expression of the institutional culture problem that the Kennedy-Carter incident and the Carter social media post crystallized. She acknowledged the officiating inadequacy from the podium and called for better technology, better pay, and full-time employment for referees, all of which are legitimate systemic improvements that the league should pursue regardless of this specific controversy. But systemic improvements applied to a two-tier system produce a better version of a two-tier system rather than a single consistent standard. And the single consistent standard is the only thing that resolves the specific problem she is navigating while also calling for those systemic improvements. The officials are not the primary source of the cultural problem. They are the mechanism through which a cultural problem is being expressed on the basketball court. And addressing the mechanism without addressing the culture produces cleaner tools applying the same inconsistent standard. The agent question she raised, not for herself, but in the context of what the league's players collectively deserve in terms of representation and advocacy, points toward the structural gap that makes the entire situation harder to resolve than any individual policy change could address. She is represented by a firm with deep expertise in brand building and commercial partnerships, and the endorsement deals and marketing relationships they have built for her are genuinely impressive in their scale and their fit with her public identity. The question being asked by observers watching her absorb targeting without adequate institutional protection is a different question. Not whether her endorsement portfolio is well managed, but whether someone is fighting for her in the closed-door conversations where institutional decisions about officiating emphasis and player protection priorities are actually made. Every player in the league deserves representation that operates across both of those dimensions, commercial advocacy and institutional advocacy. And the players who have been in this league for years without either dimension being adequately served have the most legitimate claim to that need, not just the newest arrival. The union structures available to WNBA players have historically operated with significantly less leverage than their NBA counterparts. And the moment of commercial growth the league is currently experiencing represents the first genuine window in years where that leverage has increased to the point where institutional demands could produce structural outcomes. Using that window to advocate only for commercial improvements while the physical safety standards remain inadequate would be the specific kind of missed opportunity that the league and its players would look back on in 5 years as the moment when everything was available and the right questions were not asked loudly enough. The Carter incident, the social media post, the press conference, and the ongoing injury situation are individually meaningful and collectively point toward a single conclusion: that the league has not yet been willing to state publicly in the direct terms the moment requires. The most commercially valuable player in the history of women's professional basketball is being physically targeted in a pattern that the officiating infrastructure is not adequately addressing. And the institutional response has been calibrated to the speed of the press release cycle rather than to the speed of the game. That calibration is a choice. It is not a resource problem. It is not a technology problem. It is not a competency problem. It is an organizational priority decision about how much urgency the protection of this specific player requires relative to other institutional concerns. Every game that passes under the current calibration adds to the record that the league's own review process is generating. A record of incidents, upgrades, statements, and continued patterns that will eventually be examined in the context of whatever commercial negotiation or legal proceeding treats it as relevant evidence. She is carrying the weight of that record publicly with a composure and a generosity that the institutional environment has not earned and that nobody should reasonably expect to be infinite. And when she said at the podium that it probably affects her more than she lets on, the league should hear that as the most important sentence she has delivered in any press conference this season. What comes next is either the league building the environment she described, protected players, consistent officiating, media attention on basketball rather than controversy, or the continued cycle that she laid out as clearly as any organizational analysis could. And the answer to which of those futures the WNBA is choosing is being written by what happens before the back-to-back in Phoenix and the games that follow it.